On the morning of March 14, 2018, when the police knocked on the door of a modest single-story house on Willow Creek Road in Dayton, Ohio, the brother standing inside the hallway did not look surprised, did not ask questions, and did not even ask what had happened. And that absence of reaction would later become the most disturbing clue in the entire case. Because when Detective Alan Morris said the words, "Your brother Daniel Harper was found dead," the man across from him, Matthew Harper, simply nodded once as if he had been told the weather forecast, and that moment would be replayed again and again in interrogation rooms, courtrooms, and forensic lectures for years. Because brothers usually scream, deny, collapse, or demand answers. But Matthew did none of that, and at the time, no one thought it meant anything at all. Daniel Harper was 42 years old, worked as a warehouse supervisor, lived alone in a rented apartment 10 minutes away, and was known as quiet, dependable, and painfully routine-driven. The kind of man who paid bills early and never missed a Sunday call with his older brother Matthew, who had practically raised him after their parents died in a car crash when Daniel was 19. And because of that history, everyone assumed Matthew was simply in shock, because shock looks different in different people, and not questioning bad news is common. So the officers left without pushing further, marking Matthew as cooperative, calm, and grieving. Daniel's body had been found that morning by a maintenance worker after complaints of a strange smell coming from the apartment, and the scene looked simple at first glance. Daniel was lying on his bed, fully clothed, no blood, no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no forced entry. His wallet was on the nightstand, phone on the charger, keys on the kitchen counter, and the apartment door had been locked from the inside, which immediately pushed the case toward natural causes, especially since Daniel had a known history of high blood pressure and mild heart issues. And when the responding paramedic noted livor mortis consistent with someone who had been dead for roughly 8 to 10 hours, everything aligned neatly enough to prevent deeper suspicion, at least initially. The first thing that subtly didn't align, though, was time. Daniel was last seen alive at 9:30 p.m. the previous night by a grocery store cashier named Linda Chavez, who remembered him clearly because he bought the same items every Tuesday: frozen meals, bottled water, a newspaper, and chewing gum. And he had complained casually about a headache, nothing dramatic, just a passing comment. But the medical examiner later estimated his time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. And while that still fit the timeline, it would later clash violently with something else entirely. Matthew Harper told police he last spoke to Daniel on Sunday night, not Tuesday, which already contradicted the routine Daniel was famous for, because every Sunday at exactly 8 o'clock p.m., Daniel called Matthew, and phone records later confirmed that call did happen. But something Matthew said during that initial conversation with police would quietly sit unnoticed in the report. Matthew mentioned, without being prompted, that Daniel had been complaining about chest pain for days, a detail that hadn't yet been released to anyone, because the autopsy hadn't been done, and no medical cause had been established, and the officer writing the report didn't flag it because chest pain is a common assumption when someone dies suddenly, and confirmation bias makes normal assumptions invisible. The autopsy the next day initially supported the natural death theory. No trauma, no fractures, no internal bleeding, heart slightly enlarged, coronary arteries showing moderate narrowing, nothing dramatic, and the preliminary cause of death was listed as probable cardiac arrhythmia pending toxicology, and that should have closed the case entirely, except for one thing that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with human behavior. Matthew Harper never once asked to see the body. He didn't ask when the funeral would be, didn't ask if Daniel had suffered, didn't ask what exactly killed him, didn't ask who found him, didn't even ask what time he died. And while grief can look silent and numb, experienced investigators know silence has texture, and Matthew's silence was smooth, unbroken, and deliberate. Friends and coworkers of Daniel described Matthew as protective to the point of control. He managed Daniel's finances, helped choose his apartment, insisted Daniel call him daily instead of weekly at one point, and had once shown up unannounced at Daniel's workplace after Daniel missed 2 calls, behavior that at the time was framed as brotherly concern, but would later be re-examined under a harsher light. The toxicology report arrived 10 days later, and this is where everything began to unravel slowly, because the report showed trace amounts of digoxin, a medication used for heart conditions, in Daniel's blood, and that alone wouldn't have been alarming if Daniel had been prescribed it. But he hadn't. His pharmacy records showed no such medication. His medical records showed no prescription history, and no digoxin was found in the apartment. And the level detected wasn't high enough to be immediately fatal on its own, but it was enough to destabilize heart rhythm in someone with underlying heart issues, and that shifted the cause of death from natural to suspicious, though still not conclusively homicide. When detectives returned to Matthew with this information, his reaction was again unsettlingly calm. He said, "That makes sense." And when asked why, he replied that Daniel had mentioned trying a heart medicine someone recommended, a statement that raised more questions than it answered. Because Daniel was famously cautious about medication and rarely took even over-the-counter painkillers without consulting Matthew first. And when asked who recommended it, Matthew said he didn't know. And when asked why he hadn't mentioned this earlier, Matthew said he didn't think it mattered. Investigators requested Matthew's phone records next, and what they found was not dramatic at first glance, but patterns are more powerful than single events. Matthew had called Daniel 6 times between 11:45 p.m. and 1:10 a.m. the night Daniel died, all unanswered, and that by itself could be explained away, except Matthew had told police he was asleep by 10:30 p.m., and phone location data placed Matthew's phone not at his home, but within half a mile of Daniel's apartment between midnight and 12:40 a.m. And when confronted with this, Matthew said he had gone for a drive because he couldn't sleep, a habit he claimed he'd had for years, though no one else could confirm this, and gas station footage from that night showed Matthew's car passing by Daniel Street at 12:17 a.m., slowing briefly, then continuing on. Still, this wasn't enough for an arrest, but it reopened everything, and a second autopsy review was ordered, focusing specifically on poison delivery methods. Digoxin poisoning often leaves subtle signs, and when tissue samples were reanalyzed, they found needle puncture marks on Daniel's upper arm that had been mistaken initially for insect bites, small, faint, and easily overlooked. But under magnification, they were unmistakably injection sites, and that changed the entire narrative instantly. Investigators searched Daniel's trash again and found a discarded insulin syringe wrapped in paper towels at the bottom of the bin outside the building. No fingerprints, but the timing of trash disposal lined up with Matthew's presence in the area. When Matthew was asked directly if he had injected Daniel, he didn't deny it immediately. He asked instead, "Is that what you think happened?" A question that seems harmless but in interrogation psychology is considered deflection, not denial, and still, the most haunting question remained unanswered. Why didn't he question anything at first? The answer to that question wasn't emotional numbness, and it wasn't shock, and it wasn't ignorance, it was familiarity. Matthew didn't ask questions because he already knew the answers, but proving that required peeling back years of subtle control, financial dependence, and quiet resentment that never looked like violence until it was examined under forensic light. Investigators uncovered that Daniel had recently told coworkers he planned to move to another state for a better job opportunity, something he had not told Matthew, and emails on Daniel's laptop showed he had applied for apartments in Indiana, and one unsent draft email to Matthew read, "I need to start making decisions on my own," a sentence that never reached its recipient, and phone metadata showed that email was written just hours before Daniel died. Financial records revealed Matthew was listed as beneficiary on Daniel's life insurance policy, a policy Daniel had taken out years earlier at Matthew's suggestion, and the payout was substantial enough to clear Matthew's debts, including a second mortgage he had never disclosed to anyone. Still, money alone doesn't explain calm, but control does, and Matthew had been controlling Daniel's medications for years, often holding onto prescription bottles to make sure he took them correctly, a behavior confirmed by multiple family friends. When investigators searched Matthew's home, they found an old prescription bottle for digoxin prescribed not to Daniel, but to Matthew's late father, expired but still potent and missing several pills. When asked why he had it, Matthew said he never threw things away, and that answer might have worked if he hadn't already demonstrated precise, selective behavior in every other aspect of his life. The final piece that explains the lack of questioning came from a voicemail Daniel left Matthew at 11:38 p.m. The night he died, a voicemail Matthew deleted but that investigators recovered from the carrier. And in that voicemail, Daniel's voice is calm but strained, and he says, "I don't feel right. I think something you gave me wasn't okay." And then the line cuts off, and Matthew never mentioned that voicemail to police, not once. Because you don't ask questions about a death when you already know how it happened, and you don't act surprised when the outcome was expected. And that realization would later make jurors physically recoil when it was played in court. When Part 2 begins, the case has already shifted from suspicious death to deliberate homicide. But the most important question still remains unanswered in the minds of investigators, jurors, and viewers alike: why Matthew Harper never questioned anything at the beginning. And the answer finally becomes undeniable only when every small, overlooked human detail is lined up in the correct order, because crimes like this are not solved by one dramatic clue, but by dozens of quiet ones that only make sense together. After recovering the deleted voicemail, detectives re-interview Matthew on April 3, 2018 at the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. And this time the tone changes because they do not accuse him directly, they simply ask him to explain his silence. And his answers start collapsing under their own weight, because when someone is innocent, their story expands naturally. But when someone is hiding knowledge, their story shrinks and hardens, and Matthew's answers became shorter, flatter, and oddly rehearsed. When asked why he never asked to see Daniel's body, Matthew says he wanted to remember his brother alive, which sounds reasonable, until detectives point out that Matthew insisted on handling the funeral arrangements personally and selected a closed casket service without consulting anyone else, including Daniel's closest friends, which means he avoided seeing the body while making sure no one else could either. When asked why he didn't ask what time Daniel died, Matthew answers that knowing the time wouldn't change anything. But investigators know that time of death is one of the first questions grieving family members ask, even subconsciously, and especially someone as controlling and detail-oriented as Matthew had always been. The evidence keeps stacking, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in quiet, irreversible ones like phone behavior, because Matthew's phone shows he searched. How long does digoxin stay in system? 3 weeks before Daniel died, and later claimed it was related to a television show he was watching, but his streaming history showed no such program. And the search was followed by, does digoxin cause sudden death? And can digoxin look like heart attack? Questions no grieving brother types after death, but someone planning an outcome would type before. Investigators also noticed that Matthew never once asked whether the digoxin level was lethal, because he already knew it wasn't meant to be overtly lethal on its own. The plan relied on Daniel's existing heart condition to do the rest, which is why the dose was low enough to delay suspicion, but high enough to destabilize the rhythm. And this is why Matthew was calm at first, because the death unfolded exactly the way he expected it to look: natural, quiet, and unquestioned. The financial motive becomes clearer when detectives uncover that Daniel had recently changed the beneficiary of his retirement account, removing Matthew entirely. But that change had not yet processed fully at the time of death, which means Matthew stood to lose long-term control and future access. And that kind of loss is not emotional. It is existential to someone who defines themselves by dominance over another person. Former coworkers described Daniel becoming more confident in the weeks before his death, saying things like, "I don't need permission anymore," and "I'm tired of being treated like a child." And that psychological shift matters, because abusers escalate when control begins slipping, and Matthew's escalation was subtle, precise, and masked as care because digoxin was not forced violently, it was introduced, under the pretense of help and routine, which Daniel trusted, because Matthew had trained him to trust without question for decades. The most devastating moment in court does not come from forensic experts or detectives. It comes from a simple timeline chart shown to the jury that overlays Daniel's symptoms, Matthew's phone location, and the voicemail timestamp. And when placed together, it shows that Daniel felt unwell minutes after Matthew was near the apartment, and the voicemail accusing Matthew directly was sent before Matthew claims to have gone home and slept, and that timeline cannot be explained away by coincidence or misunderstanding. Matthew's defense tries to argue that grief manifests as emotional shutdown, but the prosecution dismantles this by calling a grief psychologist, who explains that shock suppresses emotion but not curiosity, and that even numb individuals ask basic orienting questions, because the brain seeks to understand loss. And Matthew's lack of questioning was not numbness, it was certainty. The final blow comes from an unexpected place, a neighbor named Ronald Keene, who testifies that around midnight, he saw Matthew standing in Daniel's doorway, not rushing, not panicked, but calm and still. And when asked what he was doing, Matthew allegedly said, "Just checking on my brother." And that phrase echoes back to the very first police interaction, when Matthew said the same words almost reflexively, as if rehearsed, and repetition like that is not accidental, it is scripted behavior. When Matthew takes the stand, he denies everything, but his denial is technical, not emotional. He says he did not kill Daniel, but never says he loved him, and never says he misses him. And when asked directly why he never questioned the death, he pauses for nearly 12 seconds before answering. And in that silence, the jury sees the truth, because people who lose someone suddenly want answers, and people who cause death already have them. The verdict comes back guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder. And during sentencing, the judge states that this was not a crime of rage or accident, but a crime of quiet certainty and calculated familiarity. And that sentence captures the entire reason Matthew never questioned anything at first, because questioning is what you do when something surprises you, and Daniel's death did not surprise Matthew at all. It confirmed what he had already set in motion. The case later becomes part of behavioral analysis, training for homicide investigators, as an example of how silence can be louder than tears, and how the absence of questions can be the most damning evidence of all. Subscribe for more real cases where science, behavior, and truth expose what people try hardest to hide, and comment below if you notice the silence before the evidence. Because sometimes the first clue isn't what someone says, but what they never ask.